A warm welcome to all of you. Many have already been treated to a wonderful meal prepared by Chef Daniel and had an opportunity to get to know each other. All of you here in the beautiful Maison Francaise and online have come to honor three outstanding awardees and to gain insight into them and their ideas. Arthur C. Clarke is often remembered for his book 2001, A Space Odyssey, and co-scripting of the movie with Stanley Kubrick. And for younger folks, are there younger folks here? Would you raise your hand? Yay, that's what I thought. That's fabulous. For younger folks who don't know this book or the movie, I strongly recommend it. Yet Sir Arthur was so much more than that. Not only was he a prolific writer, he was a scientist who defined the geostationary satellite orbit, or the Clarke orbit as it is called, and gifted his vision of global satellite communications so that we, soon after the first satellites were launched, we could talk to each other. Moreover, he was a wit and a visionary who cared fervently about the well-being of planet Earth and all of us and all of those creatures that inhabit this planet. He lived a life that epitomized the power of imagination in critical decision-making, and he believed in the ability of our young people to lead us forward, providing us all with guidance for moving toward a better world. Arthur reminded us that the limits of the possible can only be defined by going beyond them into the impossible. It is that concept of imagination that animates the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. We do so through our intergenerational programs of Unleash Imagination, Shape the Future. Key among them are the Arthur C. Clarke Awards, which shine a light on outstanding individuals or organizations that have helped move humankind forward through their creative powers paired with expertise, hard work, and usually a bit of courage. A central and increasingly important focus of the foundation is intergenerational, where we seek to demonstrate the power and importance derived from intergenerational communications, co-mentoring, and collaboration. I'm happy to announce a very special effort in which 15 exceptional creative individuals from different sectors have volunteered to help us redesign our intergenerational program to be more expansive and have a greater impact. You will find these names in our Brain Trust members group in your online program. Some are here today. A number of others are watching online, I'm told. We will announce our results early next year, and I invite you to support us as we move forward with this important endeavor. In this vein, you will also find in your online program a memoriam to a very special man who sadly we lost this year. Many of you knew him, Tedson Myers, who helped establish the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation in 1983. He preceded me for 16 years as chairman of the foundation. It was because of his leadership that the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination was established at the University of California, San Diego, and you will meet the director of that center this evening. Consider donating to the Tedson Meyer Youth Fund, established in his honor, which will be used to fund youth scholarships. And finally, before I leave the stage, I want to thank on behalf of the foundation the major sponsors for their support for the evening and for our Unleash Imagination mission. Google, Hughes, ICANN, and Iridium. We also thank all of you who donated so generously. All sponsors and donors are noted in our program. I want to issue a special thanks, by the way, to Josh Eisenberg for supporting 24 students from Basis DC School. Raise your hands again. Yay. To join us for this evening. And so now, here's what we've all come for. We are honored to welcome 3 outstanding awardees who will be introduced by colleagues who on their own have made important imprints on the world. You will be meeting them shortly, as well as the Foundation's award chairman, Joe Bravman. And now we begin the Arthur C. Clarke Awards. Please welcome, until now, the disembodied voice you've been, please welcome, you will hear a disembodied voice so that we can begin. Later, I'll introduce that person behind that voice. Thank you. Here we go.
Thank you, Walda. Please welcome the Vice President and the Chief Internet Evangelist of Google. He himself is a Clarke Award winner 10 years ago in 2012 for his lifetime achievement. A round of applause for Dr. Vint Cerf.
Bonsoir, mesdames et messieurs. And that's all the French are going to get out of me tonight. Esther Dyson is an internet policy pioneer and investor, journalist, author, entrepreneur, commentator, and philanthropist. I think of her as the doyenne of the digital community. She's part of a remarkable family that includes her celebrated father, the late Freeman Dyson, who's also an A.C. Clarke awardee, and her science historian brother, George Dyson. Esther first came to my attention as the author and publisher of Release 1.0 through her Adventure Holdings. I was an avid reader. She followed up with her book Release 2.0 in 1997 and Release 2.1 in 1998. She began writing Release 3.0 for the New York Times 20 years ago in 2000. She's been involved with many nonprofit organizations such as the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which she chaired. I was present at the founding meeting of the board of the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers in 1998, when she was the sole board member stepping forward to the challenge of chairing the organization. I recall a particularly memorable meeting in the 1990s at CIA headquarters with Esther and John Perry Barlow, a mutual friend and colleague. The CIA staff wondered, what was this internet thing and what was it all about and how might it evolve? And we speculated about this in a very thought-provoking meeting. She is a tireless advocate for the underrepresented and worked to assure that the at-large community had roles and representation in the ICANN multi-stakeholder policy development process. We served together on the Bulgarian President's IT Advisory Council. She's been a persistent investor in Eastern European and Russian business ventures, and more recently, she founded Wellville in 2014, focused on improving equity and well-being in many dimensions, and generally has oriented her work today on health and technology. She serves on or has served as a board member on a number of organizations and contributed to many of them, such as Expanded, the Long Now Foundation, 23andMe, Evernote, Meetup, WPP Group, Xcore Aerospace, Yandex, Glasses for Humanity, Bridges.org, the National Endowment for Democracy, the Eurasia Foundation, Stop Badware, which I chaired for a while, the Sunlight Foundation, Charity Navigator, Open Corporates, and the Commons Project, and it goes on and on. She is a passionate supporter of scientific research and digital transformation. She's keenly concerned about the social, economic, and cultural impact of high technology on the lives of ordinary people. For all of these and many other reasons, it's timely and entirely appropriate to recognize Esther Dyson as the 2022 Arthur C. Clarke Innovator Awardee, and it is a special honor to introduce her tonight. So Esther, please take the stage.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome this year's recipient of the Clarke Innovators Award, Esther Dyson.
The foundation is pleased and honored to present this award to Esther Dyson for leadership and innovation in shaping internet governance and human health and equity.
Good evening. So first of all, thank you all for this wonderful award, which for me is especially wonderful because my dad got a different award from all of you some time ago. And I'm going to follow in his spirit and be a little bit of a heretic. So ironically, I got this award for innovation, but I really believe, and I'm just checking my time here, that implementation is much more important and unfortunately rarer than implementation. Than innovation. In so many companies, there are innovation groups, there are innovation people, there are wonderful ideas, and then they never get to scale. Same problem in the communities I work in. We really actually know what to do to make people healthier, to invest in health rather than to rent it from an absentee landlord. And that's really what I'm doing in Wellville, which is a 10-year nonprofit project I founded in 2014 and that ends in 2024. So to make it somewhat clearer, who in this audience is an IT person and remembers what a VAR is? Anyone want to shout it out? Okay, so the value-added reseller was the company that took the amazing computers that Cray and Digital Equipment and IBM made and the software and the Hewlett-Packard stuff, and they actually made it usable. They taught people how to use it. They connected it to the reality. And you know why God could make the world in 7 days with 1 day off? No legacy systems. But in the real world, implementation is all about connecting the legacy systems to the new things. And it's about learning to not take people's jobs, but relieve them of burdens. So in Wellville, we're doing that not at scale. We're doing it in 5 small communities because it's hard. There's a wonderful book, and I'm not going off topic, by Alison Gopnik, who is married to Elvie Ray Smith, another high-tech person, Pixar. It's called The Gardener and the Carpenter. It's a wonderful book. It's about child raising, and its basic message is never imagine that you can construct the perfect child like a carpenter. Actually, you've got this seed, and this is biologically true, and your job is to, if that seed is for a rose, turn it into the very best rose, not by constructing it, but by supporting it, by helping it, by shining sunlight. Same thing with children. One of the toughest things with children is to give them intrinsic motivation, to help them understand what they want to do, to think long-term about what they want to be, rather than bribe them with salaries or chocolates or whatever. And in the same way in the corporations, In the same way in our communities, and actually also in corporations among workforces, the trick is to help people define their own goals and then give them support in creating the sustainable organizations, work teams, project goals, whatever, that will help them reach them. But that intrinsic motivation part is really hard because it's so easy just to pay people. And honestly, that's to the extent that we want to implement change in these communities, we're also trying to change the way that foundations basically control things with short-term grants that kind of take away the focus that the community organizations might have had to whatever it is the philanthropy tells them to do. And so many well-meaning philanthropies end up kind of smothering their communities. So the solution to the implementation of so much of what we need, not so much for the environment, though we could talk about that separately, and for science, but for healthy communities, is actually helping them to do it for themselves and owning it so that they weren't given something, they built something of their own. And that's what Wellville is about. Wellville, however, is a 10-year nonprofit project, and it's not sustainable. It has no business model. It was, just for the record, it was funded by me based on some stock that was not perhaps worth what I was able to sell it for, retrospectively. But it went into Wellville, and I think it's worth a huge amount there. So the second part of this business model is, how do we give society as a whole the intrinsic motivation to understand that they want to invest in this collective asset of human health, which includes physical, mental, and economic health. And that's the end of my talk. I'd love to talk about more of that later, but I just wanted to give you a brief understanding of why I'm very proud to get the Innovators Award, but next time, the Implementers Award. Thank you very much.
Please welcome a professor at the University of California, San Diego. He is in the Department of Neurosciences. Dr. Eric Very is also the director of the Arthur C. Clarke Center for Human Imagination.
Thank you. Good evening. In the last 48 hours, we've had discussions kind of like détente between the President of the United States and the Premier of China. We've had discussions of Article 5 from the NATO alliance, and perhaps more optimistically and excitingly, the acronym TLI is re-entered our parlance. TLI stands for Trans-Lunar Injection. Yes, and go Artemis. Our NASA rocket launched yesterday on its way to circumnavigate the moon on the return to Mars by NASA. Or return to Mars, oh my goodness. Return to the moon by NASA. We'll get to Mars yet. So are we in 1972? Are we launching rockets to the moon? Are we talking about détente? Are we talking about NATO? No, we're in the 21st century. And it's a little bit weird. How is this? And of course, Arthur C. Clarke, being the director of the Clarke Center, I always like to invoke Clarke. Clarke was certainly a person of the 20th century, looking forward to this century and, of course, millennia beyond. But he was a person of the 20th century, and our challenge, and Walda has been telling you about this, to reach to younger generations. So for this year's award winner, I had a little chat, and I wanted to know, well, had he ever met Arthur C. Clarke? No, I've never met Arthur C. Clarke. Well, okay, were you inspired by him? Well, yes, and thank goodness for that. So this year's Imagination in the Service to Society Award goes to Cory Doctorow. And as I was born in Toronto, but as I did, read Clarke books as a young person. And Clarke, we often hear Clarke aphorisms, into the impossible and things like that. And I always like to look one up. And I like the challenging one, Clarke quote, the challenging one for us to think about, which is, "It is yet to be proven that intelligence has any survival value." And that's something that our species really needs to pay attention to. So Clarke was certainly an iconoclast, and so I think that was the inspiration that Cory Doctorow received from him, is the inspiration to be iconoclastic, to break down existing structures that were for exploitation, to protect the individual rights. And so Cory, like Clarke, uses his writings as not only just a storytelling, but as an intervention, a way to reach us, a way to tell us what to do, a way for us to think about the things that are happening in our society. And Cory said to me that that was his view of Clarke. And so again, that's the inspiration. So Cory, again, an incredible career all over the world, a fantastic daily blogger, which still kind of boggles my mind. How can you get all those words out all the time, plus writing book projects, plus weekly blogs, plus essays? Again, a fantastic interventionist and in complete control of knowledge of his subjects, which include privacy and security and protection of our information. So again, it's my pleasure to introduce Cory Doctorow as our Clarke Awardee.
Please welcome this year's recipient of the Clarke Award for Imagination in Service, Cory Doctorow.
The foundation is pleased to present to Cory Doctorow the Sir Arthur Clarke Imagination and Services Society Award for insights and provocation concerning technologies through fiction, journalism, and personal action.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the award. It's beautiful, and thank you for coming tonight. I want to say that science fiction writers aren't prophets, despite what some science fiction writers have ill-advisedly claimed. We are not prophets. We don't predict the future. Thank goodness we don't predict the future. If the future was predictable, there'd be no reason to get out of bed in the morning, because no matter what we did, the future would arrive. The future does not travel to us on rails. The future depends on what we do. It is not the case that optimism and pessimism are opposites. Rather, optimism and pessimism are flip sides of the same coin, fatalism. Optimism is the idea that no matter what we do, things are going to get better. And pessimism is the idea that no matter what we do, things will get worse. I brief not for optimism, neither for pessimism, but for hope. The belief that if we do things, we can make the world a better place. That if we don't know how to get from A to Z, or Z as we say in Canada, that we can at least find our way to A to B. We can ascend the gradient towards the future that we want to live in. And having ascended one step, we may find ourselves in terrain from which new steps are revealed that can take us further up that gradient. The difference between fiction and real life is that in fiction, you can start with where you want to end up and work your way back in a neat linear plot in which tension rises monotonically towards a a release of climax and then to a denouement where everybody gets a medal, and that's the end of the story. And in real life, you go up the hill, you go down the hill, you meet a setback, you go up again, you keep trying, you iterate, you repeat. Hope is not the belief that nothing can go wrong. It is not dystopian to accept the second law of thermodynamics. Entropy is not negotiable. Stuff goes wrong all the time. The choice not to put lifeboats on the Titanic does not make you an optimist. It makes you someone who is responsible for the death of thousands of people. It is not dystopian to imagine that the great climate emergency that is on our doorstep will come for us. Once again, the second law of thermodynamics is not optional. If we sink enough therms into the world's oceans, the ice caps are going to start melting, the seas are going to rise. The only dystopian move here is to imagine that we won't do anything about it. Since the 1970s, we've all been trapped on a sort of bus, barreling towards the edge of a cliff. And the people up there in first class started off for decades telling us that there was no cliff and we were worried needlessly. Then they told us that if we made the bus go really fast, it would jump over the cliff like Evel Knievel and land on the other side. And now they want us to believe that they'll retrofit the bus with wings after it goes off the cliff's edge and that we'll sail gracefully to safety. They tell us that on no account must anyone try to swerve the bus. Grabbing the wheel and turning it is an act of great irresponsibility, we're told, because someone might break their leg. To be utopian on the bus is to believe that we might make it swerve, that we can muster the courage to grab that wheel and yank it. Science fiction writers don't predict the future. But some of us, if we're very lucky, get to inspire a better one or head off a worse one. Thank you all very much for this incredible honor. It's a pleasure to see you all tonight, and I'm looking forward to our panel later.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the retired Principal Deputy Director of the CDC, the Center for Disease Control, also Rear Admiral in the Commissioned Corps of the U.S. Public Health Service, Dr. Anne Schuchat.
Good evening. What a pleasure to be part of this incredible evening with such amazing award recipients. I'm here to introduce Francis Collins as the Lifetime Achievement Awardee from the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation. The genome of humans made him a star. He might have preferred a claim on guitar. He grew up on a rural farm and somehow found a way to charm both sides of the aisle. That takes a very special style. His parents were in drama. He worked for Obama, then later Trump and Biden. Longevity there's pride in. From cancer moonshot to opioids, from tackling COVID to amyloid, increasing the research budget, not letting the grantees fudge it. He sought to study all of us. He worked to keep the public's trust. A man of great complexity, as well as some dexterity, embracing faith and science, he's not famed for his silence, appears on all the channels, but no more on the manels. You'll want him for your cause. Let's give him our applause.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the recipient of the Clarke Award, Dr. Francis Collins, receiving the Award of Lifetime Achievement.
It is our special honor to present the Lifetime Achievement Award for exceptional contributions in leadership in genomic and medical research and public health.
I don't think I've ever had such a poetic introduction. And thank you. That was really gracious and kind of funny, too. I want a copy of that, if I might please get it. What a privilege to be here with all of you and to follow these two distinguished awardees to come to this podium and say just a few words about my own background as it might be relevant to this Arthur C. Clarke Award before we engage in a conversation with our distinguished moderator, Steve Scully. But my thanks to the foundation, particularly to Walda, for convening this gathering and giving me a chance to learn from all of you in various conversations over the course of the last few hours. Looking back over the time that I've had the privilege of serving as a scientist in various locations, first at the University of Michigan, and then for the last almost 30 years within the federal government, leading the Human Genome Project, then as the National Institutes of Health Director for 12 years, and currently as a special projects advisor to President Biden. It has just been an amazing ride in terms of what science has made possible in the course of these almost 40 years. Thinking back to my initial efforts as an assistant professor in Ann Arbor, trying to tackle a problem that I thought was really important but seemed almost unsolvable, working with others, building teams, trying to figure out how you could locate the cause of a terrible disease when you didn't know anything about it. And ultimately, after many blind alleys and frustrations, discovering the cause of cystic fibrosis back in 1989. And that was the kind of effort which today could be done by a pretty good graduate student in about 2 days with appropriate equipment. So it tells you how far we have come over that time. But for me as a physician, it's incredibly gratifying to say that finally now, after some 30 years since that discovery, people with cystic fibrosis, 90% of them have access to a therapeutic that allows them not just to think about the next hospitalization, but to think about what they might want to do in retirement when they get to be 65. What a blessing it is to be able to see progress happening at that scale. But we needed to go faster. For me, as the chance ahead of leading the Genome Project, to be able to read out for the first time that first reading of the remarkable script, the DNA instruction book of Homo sapiens, and to see the way that is played out is also both exhilarating but frustrating. We now have the opportunity for virtually anybody with cancer to find out exactly what are the misspellings in your cancer that is causing those good cells to go bad, and how could we pick the right solution that would enable a good outcome from that. And we've seen some dramatic results. I have to say, though, my heart is a little heavy tonight because I spent time this morning at the bedside of a dear friend who is dying from metastatic kidney cancer, for whom all of those efforts ultimately did not succeed. And we still have a long way to go to be able to say, stage 4 cancer, no big deal. We got that one. We don't have that one yet, but we could get there with genomics, with immunotherapy. Goodness, the brain, the most complicated structure in the known universe, residing between your ears with its 86 billion neurons with incredible complexity, the circuits they're engaged in. We're starting to figure out how that works. It's going to be a long time before we completely are able to get our heads around this. Are our brains complicated enough to understand our brains? That might be a question to consider. But the way in which that plays out in terms of our understanding of things like autism, schizophrenia, PTSD, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, all those things are waiting for that next generation of major leaps that come out of the basic science understanding about how the brain works. For me as a geneticist, to see what's now becoming more and more possible with gene therapy, using this remarkable development of CRISPR, the gene editing capabilities, which nobody even heard about until about 6 or 7 years ago, and which is now being used by almost every laboratory, not just for basic science, but also for therapeutics, to see the opportunities there for those thousands of genetic diseases where we know the misspelling in the DNA, but at the moment we don't have a solution. This is a potential solution and a scalable solution, because if you could figure out how to deliver that gene editing apparatus to the right tissue in the right patient at the right time, then you don't have to go through the incredibly complicated and expensive process of sorting out every one of those genetic conditions at the metabolic level. And some of that is starting to seem actionable. Sickle cell disease, the very first molecular disease which we knew the cause of, going back to Linus Pauling, for heaven's sake, and yet has basically been there waiting for an answer. And we are now curing people with sickle cell disease, with gene editing. And that needs to be scaled, of course, to the point where it can be offered to the 100,000 people in the United States and the 5 million in sub-Saharan Africa. But we might be able to get there too. So I'm pretty jazzed about all of this in terms of the moment that we live in right now in terms of science. And I'm excited about the ways in which that not only leads to new discoveries, but the opportunity to implement them. And a big effort that I'm engaged in right now in the White House is to try to take one of those big developments of the last 10 years, the development of a cure for a disease called hepatitis C, and make sure it actually gets to the people who need it. And that is a little bit of the not so positive part of our national story, that there are 3 million people right now in our country who are chronically infected with hepatitis C and who, without interventions, are headed for liver fibrosis, liver cirrhosis, liver failure, maybe need for a liver transplant, and liver cancer. A very dark future and a very expensive future. And yet, because of the cost of the therapy and the fact that it's therefore had many barriers put up for people who don't have exceptionally good healthcare coverage, those 3 million people, for the most part, are just waiting. If we're a nation that cares about all our people, if we stand up for what the moral principle of taking care of people when you can, this doesn't seem like a good outcome. And guess what? It also has a wonderful side of it, which is likely to make it doable, which is it's both morally the right thing to do and economically it's the right thing to do. Because if you find those people and treat them, you're going to save our country about $26 billion in downstream healthcare costs that won't be necessary because they won't end up with those terrible consequences. You can tell I'm a little worked up about this one. But finally, before I use up all my 10 minutes, let me reflect a minute on COVID, because that has been an absolutely compelling, overwhelmingly exhausting, amazing, inspiring, hardworking effort of the entire scientific community since that day in January 10th of 2020, when the sequence of SARS-CoV-2 first was placed on the internet and we all knew what we were up against. And for me as the NIH director at the time, the challenge was to try to figure out how to not waste a single day to develop the vaccines, the therapeutics, the diagnostics that we were going to need if we were going to save lives. And it was amazing to see, and I hope historians will note this in the midst of all the other difficulties we've had in the last 2.5 years, about how the scientific community came together to respond to this without worrying about who was going to get the credit or which sector you were in, public sector, private sector, CDC, FDA, everybody gathering around the same table to say, okay, what can we do and how quickly can we do it? And watching that made me believe that we have in science a real way to respond to a crisis that was even better than I thought. And the vaccines that came out of this, remember, most of the time, vaccines take 5-10 years to develop. Within just 63 days, the first phase 1 trial was underway for the messenger RNA vaccines from Moderna, and shortly after that from Pfizer-BioNTech. And then this phase 2 and then the phase 3 trials. And there was that moment in November 2020 when the phase 3 trials had reached their endpoint. Remember, these are all done blinded. So even the people who are administering the shots don't know if this is the vaccine or a dummy, and the people receiving them don't know either. And every one of these trials required 30,000 people to be sure we had enough power. And we should be grateful to those people forever that they signed up to take part in such a trial. And nobody knows until you basically unblind the data and see, did it work? Some of us working on this, dreaming about this, dared to hope that maybe it would work, and maybe it would even be something like 60 or 70% effective, and maybe there wouldn't be too many bad side effects. And then there was that night in November 2020 where the data was revealed, and the efficacy was 95%. And the side effects in those 30,000 people, you couldn't tell the difference between the vaccine and the placebo. I got to say, I cried pretty hard that night. This was like unbelievable answer to prayer. And I thought, okay, we're going to be all right here. We're going to get this done. Let's get those vaccines out there into people's arms. And that's what everything was happening with Warp Speed and all the other things attached to it. And for a while, it seemed like we were on the right track. But then, as you know, it didn't all entirely work that way. And this is maybe what we'll talk about in the course of our conversation, because I've given you a lot of positives, but there's this other big worrisome thing right now, which is that 50 million people in this United States, this most advanced technological country in the world, have decided those vaccines are not for them, and that they're dangerous, they're unproven, they have all kinds of other negative effects, and they have decided to say no. And that, of course, is a kind of conversation that you would hope would happen in an open and free environment. But of course, it was colored over, as you all know, by lots of other forces of information and sometimes misinformation and sometimes potential disinformation, contributed to by political figures as well as social media, cable news, and all the rest. Kaiser Family Foundation, which I think is a pretty trustworthy, objective operation, did a model of how many people died because of misinformation about vaccines. It's frightening. 330,000 people are currently in graveyards because of their decision that vaccines were not going to be safe or appropriate for them. Our culture wars killed 330,000 people. And along with that became, unfortunately, a growing sense of divisiveness about almost everything, a tribalism, and a distrust in authoritative sources, including government. And that in turn added to a sense of growing science distrust. This is a thing that we should all be deeply concerned about. If our nation has a future, and yet we've separated ourselves out from making decisions based on evidence, objectivity, and science, how are we ever going to solve climate change or all the other things that lie in front of us? So what are we going to do about it? I'll make a minor, modest suggestion of one or two things, and then I bet we'll end up talking about this a bit. One is we need to understand human behavior better than we do. And I will personally take responsibility for having underinvested in human behavioral research prior to this to try to understand how people actually make decisions. I thought Descartes was right. I think, therefore I am. You're presented with objective information, you make a rational decision. That didn't turn out to be the way our brains actually work. The information deficit model, as it's called, where you only make a bad decision because you have an information deficit. You fill that in and then everybody will do the right thing. It does not apply, and it probably never has. And it was David Hume who got it more right, which is reason is a slave to the passions. And we got a lot of passions right now, and they're in many ways pushing reason aside. Maybe Pascal was closer to it. The heart has its reasons that reason knows not of. Our hearts are driving us in ways that our brains and our cherished rationality doesn't always figure out is there or how to deal with it. We're all really good at cognitive bias, whether we'd like to admit it or not, and that applies to me as well. So we need more behavioral research to understand that. But we also need to figure out a way to spread science to people who need to understand it, where it doesn't come across as a bunch of elitists who are basically not seen as people that currently are part of the community or people that you can trust. And unfortunately, a lot of our science communication is of that sort, including what I've done and many different appearances in the media. We need to figure out how to turn that into a much more networked situation. Maybe what we need is a science communication corps, where we would enlist all of the members of the scientific societies who know something about science. We would enlist all of the science majors in colleges and universities. We would enlist all the science clubs in high schools. We would ask a lot of the people who participate in our clinical studies, like the All of Us study that's enrolled already 500,000 people in trying to understand how genes and environment play out in health. Make them ambassadors as well about what we know and what we don't know. Provide them with the kind of materials so that they're not stuck out there without backup, that is clear and objective, it is well situated, it is nonpartisan. And I'm sorry to say, probably this would have to be funded not by the government, because that would immediately be suspicious, but by some other kind of philanthropy. That's kind of a dream that I'm kicking around, and I'd love to know what other people would think about it. And maybe we could even engage in that. The faith community, because I'm a person of faith. One of my deepest sorrows of what's happened in the last 2.5 years is how faith communities like mine, I'm an evangelical Christian, have been brought into this mindset, which has very little to do with the foundations of faith and everything to do with the political stance and the tribalism, and bring all of us back together to those principles about love and grace and truth, which unfortunately are a little hard to find these days. Maybe that is another part of what we could do. But this is not going to happen quickly. But if we have a future, I don't think we can just hope for the best, although I'm a guy who likes hope as well, and I like the definition that I heard earlier. We got to figure out how, for those of us who really do understand the consequences of continuing down this path, how can we turn this around? How can we turn ourselves back into a nation that cares for all of its people, but cares about the truth? Thank you all very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Walter Roseman.
Yeah, what do you think about our awardees, huh? I'm reminded, particularly when I heard Dr. Collins talking about how Arthur Clarke said that the more advanced science and technology became, the more it seemed like magic. And I think that a lot of what Dr. Collins has been doing falls in that category. The difference is it's not magic. It's real. And it takes special people with a lot of imagination and determination to move this forward. So thank you all. It is now my job, finally, to introduce to you the disembodied voice, who is Steve Scully. Steve has kindly, and we're very happy about it, agreed for the second year to moderate our Clarke Conversation on Imagination. He is a journalist, a broadcaster, and much more. So can we please welcome Steve Scully, moderator of the panel, to the stage.
I should point out, if things go downhill, you play the guitar and you sing?
Not here.
No. Any other talent, musical talent on the stage?
My uncle's got an old barn we can use.
You know, Dr. Eric Very really put it well, because just in the last week, and Esther Dyson, I'm going to begin with you on this. In the last week, think about what we have seen. A major climate change in Europe, in Egypt, in which the alarm bells are being raised again. A national election in which the country is deeply divided and polarized. A presidential election that began last night, 720 days before 2024, in case you're counting. But also the Artemis Moon Project. So under the category of imagination and possibilities for a better planet, a better future, you can take any one of these. This is just in the last 7 days. Esther.
And the question is?
Your thoughts about this moment where we're at.
I mean, the thing that seriously I have to wonder about is this question about, do intelligent societies inevitably destroy themselves by being so good at catering to their own short-term desires that they lose sight of the future and screw it up? Mm-hmm. And when you think about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, you know, I used to think this was a joke, just the way I thought that Facebook being addictive was a joke. But how is it that we really haven't come across other intelligent beings with whatever it takes to also build machineries and tools. I mean, there are dolphins and whatever, but we have not encountered another extraterrestrial civilization, and why not? Statistically, we should have. And I just see so many, the power to destroy is much easier to acquire than the power to build. Over the past 20 years, not the past week, we've seen so many societies fall apart. They get rid of the bad guys, but there's no capacity to govern. It's easier to destroy the bad guys than it is to get the good guys to come together and do exactly what we're talking about. And I agree with Corey. I'd just rather be hopeful, and I'm not going to give up. But as a sort of observer of the situation, that's a really serious question.
So, Corey, how do we get there? How do we build a better future? How do we use our imagination and our creativity? How do we think outside the box? What would you do?
So I've been trying to, I have an answer to this question. I reckoned it would be the one you'd ask me. It's a little long, and I'm going to make it short, but I'm also going to talk fast because I came in from London yesterday. I've drunk enough coffee to kill a rhino. So there's a guy in London, David Nutt, who is the drug czar of the UK under the coalition government. He's a psychopharmacologist of great repute. And David Nutt was asked by Her Majesty's government to evaluate all of the drugs that have been scheduled as dangerous. He convened an expert panel. They rated each of these substances on a scale of 1 to 10 based on how dangerous in their expert view they were to the individuals who took them, to their families, and to wider society. And then they ran a fairly simple statistical model that said, if you change the weights of those priorities, do we want to protect individuals, their families, or society? Is the position of the drug in terms of how dangerous it is that stable, or does it change? Some drugs are always very dangerous, some drugs are never very dangerous, but some of them, they go up and down, depending on how you prioritize those. And Professor Nutt went to Parliament and he said, look, you're the politicians. There's no empirical answer as to whether we protect individuals, society, or families. Those are political choices. You tell me your political choice, and I will tell you empirically how to make your political choice stick. I'll show you where, based on your political choice, each of these drugs belong on an empirical basis. And David Nutt had gotten into trouble because he had taken on the drinks industry. So in the US, as in the UK, almost all spirits, hard alcohol, are controlled by two companies. Almost all beer are controlled by two companies. Those two companies have excessive rents, right? They run monopolies. They have lots of money because they don't have to compete. And they also have a very easy collective action problem. When all of your industry is concentrated into two hands, it's really easy to decide what your industry's position is going to be. And this industry had told its shareholders and the Public Health Authority that binge drinking was the source of all of its profits. That if you eliminated binge drinking, there wouldn't be any profits. And that they were, nevertheless, foursquare against binge drinking, and that's why they developed a self-regulated curriculum to teach people not to binge drink. And the fact that it didn't work at all was because it's just impossible to stop people. So David Nutt had developed his own curriculum, which he did a randomized trial on, and found that he could show people how to reduce their binge drinking, which, if you'll recall, is the thing that would reduce would eliminate the profit for the duopoly that ran beer and the duopoly that ran spirits, and therefore put them out of business. So he had some powerful enemies, and shortly after he delivered his report on how to empirically rank drugs, which showed that alcohol was far more dangerous than almost all the drugs that had been scheduled and prohibited, which it empirically is. He lost his job because he published a paper in which he said that cannabis was less harmful than alcohol. He records in his book, Drugs Without the Hot Air, the conversation he had with Home Secretary Jackie Smith, where she called him up and she said, you can't say cannabis is more dangerous than alcohol. And he said, well, why not? She said, because cannabis is illegal. And he said, well, why is it illegal? And she said, because it's more dangerous than alcohol. And he said, but it's not more dangerous than alcohol. And she said, you can't compare it to alcohol. And he said, why not? And she said, because it's illegal. So evidence-based policy is within our grasp, right? We can make evidence-based policy. We can know the truth, right? We don't have to be nihilists of how to get out of the problems that we have. We can use our imaginations to think about ways to get out of the hole that we found ourselves at the bottom of. We can then use our reason to evaluate those imaginative solutions to see which ones are most likely to succeed, and then we can put them into action. But when we have excessive, unaccountable corporate control over our decision-making, then our decision-making processes become auctions instead of truth-seeking exercises. And the truth falls by the wayside. And so when we see, for example, people rejecting vaccines, on the one hand, we have good cause to be dismayed. I am dismayed. I've had 5 COVID vaccines. But on the other hand, I'm a chronic pain sufferer. And if you see me squirming around up here on stage, I squirm a lot. It's because I have chronic pain. 10 years ago, my doctor said, you know, opioids aren't nearly so dangerous as you think they are. You should take them all the time for the rest of your life. And I did my own research. And I found online information that seemed credible to me that said he was wrong, that the research was low quality, that monopolistic pharma companies were conspiring with their regulators to sell products that were dangerous to people, that they didn't care who they killed, so long as they made a buck. I was an opioid denier, right? And I was right, but epistemologically, my position was identical to the position of vaccine deniers. They're wrong, but you know, if you're not an epidemiologist or a cell biologist or an eminent scientist, you don't really know how to evaluate the evidence except by your trust in institutions. When those institutions fail you, when they act in ways that are manifestly untrustworthy, we end up polarized not by some mystical force of history, but by the easily traceable causal relationship between regulators who are captured by the firms that they're supposed to be regulating and the people who are harmed by that capture.
Thank you for that. Dr. Collins, I never met Arthur Clarke, and I think many people would use a lot of words to describe him. I would use the word curiosity, because curiosity leads to imagination, leads to creativity, can make the possible from something that may be viewed as impossible. So in your area, Alzheimer's research, cancer research, gene research, just walk us through how you look at these problems that are challenges, but you say, this can be possible.
No, it's a great question, and science is all about curiosity. I don't know any scientists who weren't initially attracted to this, at least a little bit, by a way to explore the unknown and curious about what the answer might be. Science is kind of like a detective story, you know, that there's something going on there. Maybe it's understanding how a cell works, or maybe it's understanding the cause of a disease, but you know that there is an answer. You believe in objectivity, you believe that there is such a thing as truth, and that the tools of science, if you apply them correctly and have some other people to help you along to be sure you don't make mistakes, you're going to get an answer. You're going to be like the detective who gets to the bottom of it and figures out what actually was the cause. Maybe it's easier to talk about an example. When I was a genetics fellow back in the 1980s, I was assigned a patient to take care of as part of my clinical duties, a young woman, 21, who had a diagnosis of progeria, the most dramatic form of premature aging. And she was fascinating and spunky, and she could curse like a sailor when it suited her to try to get appropriate attention to the need for doors to be openable by somebody who's only 3.5 feet tall. And I was intensely curious. What is this? This disease is very rare. Nobody had really understood it. Nobody had studied it. It's like this, oh, we got to figure this out. Some 18 years later, it happened again to a couple who happened to both be physicians, and they came looking for some help about advice about how to work on this. And it captured the imagination of a few of us all over again. It was like, we got to figure this out. And ultimately, it turned out that out of those 3 billion letters in the human genome, there was just one in virtually all of these kids that was supposed to be a C, but it was a T in a vulnerable place. And that caused this form of illness where these kids age about 7 times the normal rate. So that's profound. And it's even more profound when you realize that that change is creating a toxic protein that we're all making also at smaller quantities. This is part of programmed senescence. Aging isn't necessarily just a running down. It's actually got a clock behind it maybe because evolution wanted to get one generation out of the way so that the next one would have a chance. So we're learning all kinds of interesting things here about fundamental biological features. But then, of course, your curiosity is, okay, what do we do about this? How do we help these kids? And some of us have been obsessed about that for the course of now almost 20 years since the gene mutation was discovered in my lab. And now there's an FDA-approved drug. And I just was in a meeting last week with progeria kids at the meeting, and they weren't kids anymore. They're in their 20s. That never happened before, but it's still not good enough. Now we bring on to the stage CRISPR and the gene editing effort. We should be able to go and fix that C that should have been a T, make it back to what it should be.
But how do you do that?
Well, it means bringing all the technology and creativity together. How do you take advantage of this enzyme apparatus that searches out in 3 billion letters and finds the one that you want to fix? And how do you deliver it to the right tissue without doing harm or making mistakes along the way? So it's a whole lot of technology gets in there. But you can kind of see the path forward. It's not like total magic at this point where you just, some miracle has to happen. You can see the steps. And for a scientist, and certainly when it comes to helping out somebody whose life is really profoundly affected, this is the kind of curiosity that gets you up in the morning and keeps you up late at night, trying to see how to get the answer and make it happen. And if you could make it happen for progeria, maybe it could happen for those thousands of other diseases that are just like that, where there's just a DNA misspelling that's waiting to be fixed.
I want to drill down, and Esther, I want to come back to you and your areas of expertise. And you have called journalism holy religion, and we've been hearing tonight about the misinformation. I tell students the good news is there's more news and information out there than ever before. The bad news is there's more news and information out there than ever before.
Yeah. Before I answer, I'd just like to raise one other issue, which is that fortunately those diseases are rare. Diabetes is basically, it's really interesting. Many bad things have happened that you could blame on the environment, like plastics and the food we eat and so forth and so on. But to some extent, and some of them are changes in the environment. Diabetes, ironically, we evolved for an environment that had less food. And it's an extremely simple problem to solve, except for the implementation part, as opposed to the take the magic and make it easier to do. There's so many problems in our society that we really ought to be able to fix because we know how already. And those are the ones that, in a sense, disturb me more. How do we get society to pay to do that? It's great to do this for a few people, but when you start saying, how can we help millions and billions of people avoid diabetes or, cataracts, we're getting better at that. But there's a whole lot to do that requires a different kind of curiosity, and again, requires the social change, the willingness to pay now to avoid paying later. As you said, you actually save money by doing this stuff, but people aren't thinking long term.
So why aren't we doing it?
Because we've all become a society of people searching for short-term relief, as in addiction, versus people thinking with long-term purpose. And that goes to the culture we have. Honestly, religion, I don't want to believe in God because it's useful. But at the same time, having religion, having purpose, having a sense of, Wellville is not trying to fix the problem. It's trying to hand it over further. We need to think more about the next generation, which I'm so glad that this organization is doing. But there needs to be more of a sense of the long-term future. And we've become a world of short-term trading, of instant gratification. That you can build a business based on 15-minute delivery of stuff people should have bought yesterday. Drives me crazy. And yet it's the culture, and it's what Business Insider keeps talking about passive income, which basically means finding some trick where you don't have to work and you make money, as opposed to, I want to do meaningful work and make money as I do this meaningful work. There's a wonderful, and then I'll finally come to journalism.
Sure.
Zephyr Teachout, in her book, Break Them Up, said, in essence, profits in a business are like sex in a marriage. They're kind of fundamental to the enterprise. They're useful. They, in some form or other, they're the basis of the sustainability of whatever it is, the marriage or the business. But at the same time, more sex and more profits don't necessarily make either marriage or sex better. And we've lost the ability to think long-term because everything around us is making a short-term. Now, journalism, to me, the truth is a religion. Media is a church, and in many ways a corrupted church that, again, the purpose, the DNA, if you like, or the brain, gets corrupted by the metabolism of money. And it looks for more and more rather than better and better. The solution to journalism is a change in culture, which is another miracle. It's better education. And honestly, it's teaching children curiosity rather than pouring knowledge into their heads. There's a big difference between teaching and helping children to learn. It goes back to that intrinsic motivation thing. One is, well, you got to pass the test. You got to get into second grade. You got to make your parents happy. You got to do this, that, or the other. And learning, I got through high school so that I could go to college. Had a great time in college. Worked for the Harvard Crimson. And then actually started learning once I had an interesting job, which was, as a journalist, finding out not copying stuff that existed, which is what so much of learning in college is, but rather finding out new stuff and asking questions that hadn't been asked before. And that's what we're doing at Wellville. It's taking us 10 years to learn something, a lot. And now my next job is to help spread that.
Again, curiosity. By the way, we're going to get to your questions. You talk about marriage. I was at a wedding about 3 weeks ago, and the couple had been married for about 62 years. And I said, what is the secret to a successful marriage? And he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye, and he said, the secret is finding time to go out twice a week. Dinner dancing, a movie, a candlelight dinner. And I said, wow. And he goes, I go out Friday night, my wife goes out Saturday. So there you go. On a more serious note, we are seeing the real horrors of what's going on in Ukraine. And Corey, your own family has dealt with your own pain and suffering during World War II, before World War II. And as you think about your own background, and you might want to share this story, how and why we don't learn the lessons of war, and we see the horrific pain and suffering, families broken up in Ukraine, billions of dollars to rebuild that country at some point, and you have to ask yourself, for what? And do tell your story, if you could, for a moment.
Sure. I mean, my dad was born in a camp in Azerbaijan. His parents were war refugees. My grandmother had been a child soldier in the siege of Leningrad. She met my grandfather after being inducted into the Red Army and sent to Siberia. They deserted. They went to Azerbaijan. My dad was born. The horrors of war have often seemed inescapable, and there have been many times in our history where we've said, well, we've had the war to end all wars, or we've finally reached the point at which war is no longer conceivable because we have the ultimate deterrent, and so on. I don't pretend to understand what was in the mind of the person who launched the belligerent invasion of Ukraine. I do think that if we want to understand how it is that the Soviet Union became the failed state of Russia, we do need to accept that some of that was driven by a kind of new Marshall Plan that said we should go into Russia and, quote, unleash market forces, which turned into a kind of kleptocratic free-for-all. in which the West was complicit. There was this idea that if you just dismantled the state and moved in markets, that you would get a kind of great unleashing of a new kind of vibrant democracy. And instead what we got was a collapse into authoritarian paranoia, mass death. There was a point in the 90s when the average Russian man had a 1 in 10 chance of dying in a year from violence or addiction. That is the backstory. And there is an old joke from Ireland, not an Irish joke, but a joke from Ireland whose punchline is, if you wanted to get there, I wouldn't start from here. And I think very often when we find ourselves in the midst of humanitarian crisis, we say, what foolishness precipitated this terrible moment, but we don't actually go back and say, how was this stage set such that an act of foolishness could create this? You know, there's a shell game that writers play in fiction where they arrange the furniture off stage so that it seems like the course of action in the story is inevitable. There's a famous story called The Cold Equations that some of you may know. It's often a set text in school. And it's about someone who's delivering vaccines to a planet where there's a plague. And he takes off from the planet that has the vaccines and heads to the planet that has the plague. And he sees on his instruments that his ship is burning more fuel than he thinks it should. And he digs around and he finds a young woman who's a stowaway who's going to visit her brother who's on this planet. And he has this realization that there's no way he can land this ship with this woman on it. There just won't be enough fuel. And he's going to have to stuff her out the airlock. And the author of this story came up with 6 different ways in which he could save the girl. And he sent it to his editor over and over again, John W. Campbell. John W. Campbell kept sending it back, and he said, no, the girl has to die. Because the point of this story is that this is inevitable, that there is no cure for the foolishness of a young woman who acts impetuously. John W. Campbell was a terrible person. He was an outright racist. He was a fascist, an actual fascist sympathizer, not a hyperbolic fascist. He said that the Kent State Massacre was people getting what they deserved. He was in every way a terrible person. And this was one of the expressions of his terribleness. The Cold Equations is taught as a story about how the universe doesn't care about your feelings. But the reality is that everything interesting about the Cold Equations happens before the story begins. They build a spaceship with no reserve fuel and no autopilot, and they have a distant planet where there is a crew who are exploring it who didn't go with a store of vaccines. I mean, all of these things are choices that were taken before the moment. And then we arrive at that moment of crisis and we say, look at how inevitable this crisis feels. Look at how horrific, and look at how cold and unfeeling the universe is. Who could have anticipated this? The reality is we could have all anticipated it, right? In hindsight, we can see it. In fact, in foresight, we should have seen it. And I think that, we look to the years in which, for example, Russian oligarchs were welcome as quote unquote legitimate businessmen in Europe. And in America, and who their wealth was treated as a perfectly decent part of our global economy. We allowed that country to slip into ever more barbarous kind of authoritarianism, and we said, well, just so long as they're shipping their petrochemicals abroad, and so long as their money is flowing into our black banks, it's going to be fine. And then we turn around and we go, well, look at how corrupt and corroded this country is. Look at how its strongman leader is able to take these unilateral actions. Look at how oppressive its media is. Who could have anticipated it? Well, we could have anticipated it, right? We could have anticipated it when Russian oligarchs were using the UK's incredibly overreaching libel laws to go after their critics in the UK, including Russian dissidents who criticized them, right? We could have anticipated it years and years ago. We launched the spaceship with no reserve fuel and no autopilot to a planet with no extra vaccines, and then we pushed the girl out the airlock, and we were like, I guess that's just how the universe works. We could have taken a step.
But so Putin in particular, but there's also Elon Musk, there's Tony Hsieh, there's so many people who accumulate power.
Yeah.
And then power first seduces, then it corrupts. And so the people surrounding these people don't stop them. And because they want that power too. I mean, Putin is surrounded by people. Getting rid of Putin won't solve the problem because one of them will come and take over. But we're now doing the same thing in Silicon Valley, where, again, the obsession is not with profits, it's with exits. And boards give money to people without putting in proper controls or doing due diligence. And there's this sort of fascination with power, both inside and outside, that lets these people do crazy stuff. I mean, they may be crazy. Most of them had really abusive childhoods, but we're allowing this to happen. You're right. And it's foreseeable.
There's a form of tech exceptionalism. So tech exceptionalism used to be, we should just exercise forbearance as these firms do things that were historically prohibited, because look at how great they are. And now there's
How much money they're worth.
Look at how much money they're worth. Now there's a new form of tech exceptionalism, which is these firms are run by evil geniuses. Look at how much harm they've created. And there's like a non-exceptionalist version of that story that goes, these firms are led by ordinary mediocrities, no worse than you or me. They're not geniuses. They're not even particularly evil. What they are is ungoverned. What we've done is we've taken the historic mechanisms by which we would say no, and we didn't say no. We let them buy their competitors. We let them merge with their major competitors. We let them engage in anti-competitive pricing. We let them engage in unlawful conduct related to privacy and so on. We didn't punish them, or if we punished them, we punished them with fines that were less than the profits that they realized, so that the fine became a price. And they acted exactly as anyone would. They are neither evil nor geniuses.
But enough about Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX.
Yes.
$32 billion in 7 days. That would make.
Well,
They treat,
quote $32 billion.
Yes, right. They
32 billion
treat-
magic beans.
they treat their people like robots and like playthings instead of like human beings, and they get away with it.
Dr. Collins, I want to turn to one of your obsessions.
I have
Each one of
several.
us.
Mhm. Which one is it this time, Mr.
Let's see. Guitars, motorcycles. No, in all seriousness, we have all been affected by cancer. Every single one of us either has lost a loved one, knows somebody battling cancer, a friend, a neighbor. We know this is personal for President Biden. I want you to kind of put into context where we are, where we're going, and I want to go back to Richard Nixon in 1972 when he declared the war on cancer, and give us the broad overview of how we got to this point and how we get to the next 25 years.
All in about 3 minutes. Okay, so when Nixon declared the war on cancer, that was an important milestone because it said, we're going to take this seriously. It was timing.
And we weren't
was-
taking it before that?
Not so much. I think it was like, okay, that's one of those things that's just going to happen. It was not seen as a priority that we got to pull all of the resources together to try to figure this out, come up with better ways to treat, and maybe a little bit about prevention as well, although a lot of people were smoking as they signed that document. So the problem, of course, in 1972, we had really no idea what cancer was. It was only about 10 years later that the first real evidence occurred that cancer is a disease of the genome. It comes about because of mistakes in DNA that cause a gene that normally is supposed to tell you to grow to say, just keep on growing. Or a gene that's supposed to be the brakes stops working and the cell grows when it's not supposed to. And basically, we know that now. This is like fundamental cancers. Now, some of those are inherited. So somebody who has a BRCA1 mutation in all of the cells of their body is already one step down that pathway. But we also know cancer is a multi-step disease. It takes other things on top of that single mutation in order for the cell to become truly malignant. So we're cataloging all of that over the course of the last 30 years. And we know a ton about the kinds of genes that are capable, if misspelled, in causing cancer to happen. And there's been a huge effort to try to identify pharmaceutical interventions that are targeted towards each one of those cancer genes that we know is fairly common. whether it's P53 or whether it's RAS or whether it's one of the mismatch repair genes. All of those have big therapeutic efforts, not all of which have succeeded, but certainly no lack of effort. And we've arrived at the point, because it now becomes so affordable to look at the complete genome of somebody's cancer to say, okay, for this person, what's driving that malignancy? And then you can look at the menu of therapeutics and pick the one that's actually the best match, or better yet, the 2 or 3 that are a best match, because combination therapy oftentimes is what it takes to really be effective. So the good news is we are now curing people that we didn't used to cure. And if you can look at the statistics, it's actually pretty gratifying. Deaths from cancer have been dropping for the last 25 years by about 1% or a little more than that every year. So we're now 25% lower deaths from cancer than we were 25 years ago. It's happened gradually. It's been hard fought, but it is happening. But of course, it still means we're losing 600,000 people or so every year dying from cancer that we didn't succeed with. And many of those are what we call solid tumors: colon cancer, pancreatic cancer, brain cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, where once those get outside of the original site where the tumor was located and become so-called metastatic, stage 4, we don't do very well. Now, there are some examples where that still works. Melanoma, for instance, with immunotherapy. And that's been some of the most exciting results of the last 10 years. And immunotherapy has been worked on for 40 years by people like Steve Rosenberg, but it seemed like it was like, okay, maybe it's going to work, but maybe it isn't. In the last 10 years, this is like some of the most exciting results you can imagine. Figuring out how to take your own immune system to school and teach it. There's a cancer in there. Go and find it instead of going to sleep on you, which is what checkpoint inhibitors do and what other kinds of ways of activating your own immune system. And we're starting to see some dramatic, admittedly, not as frequently as I would like, examples. People with stage 4 pancreatic cancer who have liver that's full of dozens of tumors, who after one of these immunotherapy protocols, which is very precisely done just for them, it's like precision oncology taken to the max, and the tumors are gone. I wish it happened every time, and we need to understand why it doesn't happen every time. But somewhere in there, this combination of genomics and immunotherapy is starting to give you hope that we might get to the point where you could say cures for stage 4 disease are not needing to be that rare. Final thing I'd say is it would be much better if you didn't have a stage 4 cancer to begin with. Can't we do a better job of early detection and prevention? And there's another exciting area right now, which we're all hopeful is going to make a big difference, which is the ability to be able to look in a simple blood sample that we could take on any of you and look for something called cell-free DNA. That is DNA that's not inside one of your white cells. Put them all aside. Just look at the free-floating DNA in your blood. Whoa, what's that doing? Well, cancer cells are not very well organized, and they tend to actually not stay very sustainable, every one of them. And some of those cancer cells die, and they release their DNA, and it ends up in your bloodstream. And so being able to detect that as a very early sign of the fact that somewhere in your body there is a cancer getting started could completely revolutionize the way we do screening. Whereas right now we have specific kinds of screens like mammograms or colonoscopies for specific organs. Maybe you just do one blood test a year and you know whether something is incubating there. And there's all kinds of reasons that this might not work. Like, okay, you only discover the cancers that are already far advanced and you haven't really done anything to save lives. Or maybe you have false positives and people then go through a very nerve-wracking and expensive set of follow-ups and find nothing. And we really need to understand that. And those studies are now getting underway as part of the reignited cancer moonshot, which President Biden has pushed forward, I think, very appropriately at this time, where there are answers like that we might be able to get. So cancer is in this remarkably exciting phase of accumulating new information, but we still have a long way to go before we could say that war on cancer declared all those 50 years ago has actually been won. Maybe it'll be won in 20 or 30 years for most cancers, but remember, cancer is 1,000 diseases. It's not just one. Every cancer in every organ and every person, essentially, is its own thing. And we will make success happen bit by bit. It won't happen with one big sudden announcement. Okay, no more worry about this. We'll have to keep chipping away.
Does that excitement not deserve a round of applause? Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you. Esther, I don't want to put a cold blanket on that excitement.
But you're about to. Is that
Well, we are a deeply divided nation.
Oh my God, yes.
And a lot of that divisions come from the social media that we talked about and partisan media. And I'm just wondering, as you look at that landscape, do you see any way, any hopeful way to change that?
Yes. First, interestingly, I want to take, is my mic working?
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. I want to, so there's kind of two ways to detect cancer. You look at specific cells. You also can look, like with a PET scan, you look for the metabolism, which is really interesting. So sugar flows to places that are growing fast because they need food. And if you put fluorescence or something into the sugar, second thing you can do for what it's worth is you can send radiopharmaceuticals pretty much in the same way, which enables you to catch metastases. So radiopharmaceuticals are going to be really interesting too. But same thing with information. You can look at something and say, oh, it comes from tabula or something, which means it's likely to be junk. There's a lot of this misinformation is not political, it's financial. It's political because that gets people excited. But if you follow the money flows, that's where the most damage happens. And so things like simply reducing the number of times something can be copied is a really big thing. Another thing that's really important is moderation. I mean, fundamentally, companies need to understand, just as you need product safety, you need information safety. And you need Facebook and Meta, Twitter, they're all firing their governance. Governance is just like product safety or food safety or making sure your garments are inflammable or whatever it is. That needs to be just stuck back into the content business, media as a whole, one way or another. Then there are also things like user moderation, where you have to moderate 3 other comments before you can post your own. Bill Gates used to talk about friction-free, and it drove me crazy, because we need friction. Friction slows down the growth of, basically, it's like weeds and invasive species. The more friction you have, the harder it is for them to get hold. There's not, and I'm answering with a bunch of different ideas, there is no simple solution. But there are a lot of things we can do. The other challenge, when I first went to Russia in 1989, I learned about deaths of despair, mostly from alcohol, and what I call negligent suicide. Don't care enough to be really careful, so you drive drunk, and you didn't exactly commit suicide, but you weren't trying that hard to stay alive. And the second thing was cynicism. I once asked a Russian journalist, so what did you think of when you heard, what does that word truth mean to you? And ironically, of course, Pravda means truth, was the big Russian state newspaper. And she said, well, we didn't really worry about the truth so much as, for example, we would get a press release from the government about the health dangers of butter. And we would run out and buy as much butter as we could because we knew that it meant there was going to be a shortage. And then we would publish the article. So the question was always, what was the purpose of this so-called information being revealed rather than the information itself? And nobody believed anything. The hardest question you could ask parents was, what do you tell your children? Because if you told them the truth, they might speak it at school and you would get into trouble. And find an old Russian, ask them that, and and that's what we need to fight, not with a magic single-use detergent. but somehow a changing attitude. But some of these tricks, and then at the other end, education, parents who are able to love their children so they have security and develop curiosity rather than just, you got to get through school so you can get a job. And, and we need to price in the externalities, especially we need to pay people enough to live decent lives, and we need to pay caregivers and educators and teachers for the long-term benefit they provide to society rather than just the short term.
We're going to get to your questions, so begin thinking about them in the next minute or two. I think there are microphones around. That's got to be the world's smallest notebook.
Yeah, I like a notebook I can stick in my pocket.
You can actually read off of that?
Well, my handwriting has been illegible for most of my life, so it doesn't get more legible if I have a bigger notebook.
We were talking about misinformation, your distrust of big tech, and I came across the term choke capitalism.
Choke point.
Choke point. What is
There's
that?
a book.
Yeah, there's a book. So Rebecca Giblin, who's a colleague of mine, a professor of law at the University of Melbourne, and I wrote a book that's come out recently called Choke Point Capitalism. And both of us have spent a couple of decades in what is often called the copyright wars. And we observed that for 40 years, there's been a monotonic expansion of copyright. Copyright now lasts longer. It covers more subjects. The statutory damages for violating copyright are higher. And the ease with which one can acquire those statutory damages, proven infringement, has only increased. And that over those 40 years, as copyright has expanded, the copyright industries, the culture industries, have grown steadily more profitable. And yet the share of income accruing to the creative workers who produce those profits ultimately has declined both in real terms and proportionally. And we've been asked to blame either the entertainment industry, we all know about the evil record contracts that had all kinds of unfair terms, or the tech industry. We all know about the evil tech industry plans to move fast and break things, take things without paying for them. And we're asked to root for one or the other as our champion, right? Big tech to be the savior of users of information, big content to be the saviors of creators of information. But to reference the end of Animal Farm, and apologies for the spoiler if you haven't read a 70-year-old Orwell novel, when the firms acquire dominance, they become indistinguishable. The animals have a revolution. It's led by the pigs at the end of the novel. The pigs invite the farmers over for dinner, and they surrender to them, or they throw in their lot with them, and the animals who they betrayed look through the window of the farmhouse, from the pigs to the men, and the men to the pigs, and they're indistinguishable. So choke point capitalism is when you have firms that control access to an audience. And in order to reach that audience as a creative worker, you have to go through the choke point that they operate. And whatever copyright Parliament or Congress has seen fit to give you is just taken off you at that choke point. Giving creators more copyright under those circumstances is like giving your bully kid extra lunch money. Doesn't matter how much lunch money your kid has, the bullies are going to take it. In fact, if the bullies go around and they run a campaign, more lunch money for the starving children of America, it's still not going to get the kids fed. That you need structural changes to make that work. So our book, the first half of it, unwinds these very Baroque accounting scams that describe the way that the ad markets have been rigged, the way that streaming markets have been rigged, the way that other creative markets have been rigged, audiobooks and so on. But the second half of the book addresses itself to structural solutions. None of them are individual. We actually had an editor say, I would publish this book, but I'm not going to buy it because in the second half of the book, all you do is explain what we can do as a society and nothing that the individual reader can do. And it's going to bum out your readers. And we're like, dude, you are so close to getting it here. You're not going to shop your way out of a monopoly any more than you're going to recycle your way out of climate change. These are systemic problems. And so we describe ways that you can systemically address it. For example, if you get royalties, you generally in your contract have the right to audit your royalty statement. If you go and you audit your royalty statement, you might find that there was an accounting error made that was adverse to you in the calculation of your royalties. In fact, we cite a company that has done tens of thousands of these audits of record label contracts over decades. And in all but one instance where they have found a discrepancy, it was in the favor of the label and not the artist. We have no explanation for this. We assume it's a localized probability storm. But when you find that error in your favor and you go to or in your detriment rather, and you go to the label and you say, you owe me some money, you stole money from me, they say, you know, you're adorable, but you just can't do math. We don't really owe you anything. But because we're such good-natured slobs, how about we give you half of what we owe you, but you have to sign a non-disclosure and promise not to tell anyone else where we're hiding the money we stole from you so that they can't find out where we're hiding the money we stole from them. Now, all of these contracts, they're consummated in California, New York, Washington State, and Tennessee because of Nashville. Contract is a matter of state law. You amend 4 state laws to say, as a matter of public policy, non-disclosure cannot be enforced when it pertains to material omissions or misstatements and royalty statements. And at the stroke of a pen, you put more money into the pockets of more artists than 40 years of copyright term extension combined. There's a crack in the machine that we stick a pole in it, we wiggle it around, money pours out of the machine and into the pockets of artists. And so rather than merely making copyright last longer, cover more works, which ultimately, when it comes to creators in a monopolistic market, is just the right to be angry at your fans, instead, we can create a regime that actually puts groceries on the tables of artists, pays for their kids' braces, pays their rent, affects the material circumstances of their lives. And so that's what the book is about.
You know, I'm reminded, yes, thank you.
Thank you.
We gave $54 billion to the airline industries. They now have how many more seats on those planes, and you're sitting in the plane like that, and the refunds are hard to come by. They're being fined by the Department of Transportation because they've been screwing us.
Oh, forget the airlines. The telcos got $46 billion to extend broadband to rural America. They spent it on copper. Copper. They might as well have invested in Dixie cups and yarn. Right? If you're going to pull a mile of copper, you could pull a mile of fiber. Right? They did it because they didn't want anyone to know how crappy their service was, because for so long as everything is copper, no one has fiber and no one knows how garbage their copper is. Right? Billions of dollars in public money, tens of billions of dollars in public money squandered on monopoly carriers who have divided up this country like the Pope dividing up the New World so that no one has to compete with anyone. When Frontier went bust during the lockdown, we found out that there were 1 million homes that they had booked as extra profit on their books because they knew they had no option, which meant that they could give them slower service and charge them more and service it less. We found out that Frontier calculated that they could make an extra $1 billion over a decade by building fiber to 6 million households, but they chose not to because 10-year capital expenditures were frowned upon by the analysts who controlled the share price of their firm, and the executives were all paid in shares, so that meant that they would have less money at the end of the year individually, even though the firm would have made $1 billion, and 6 million American households would have had fiber broadband instead of having their kids in the parking lot of a Taco Bell doing their distance education during COVID, right? That is the problem of monopoly, and it is the problem of a failure to address ourselves to material circumstances and instead engaging in ideological flights of fancy about what a free market might someday do instead of looking at what the actual market is actually doing.
Dr. Collins, final question for me, and then we'll get to your questions. In imagining the possibilities as you look at healthcare in general moving forward, what is possible? Where is your curiosity? What do you imagine?
Well, it's a broad sweep from the basic science discoveries that are waiting to be made all the way to how we implement those discoveries into healthcare that's actually available to everybody. We don't have that right now. We have a healthcare system that is riddled with inequities and disparities. I am pretty bullish about what we could do with the research arena, just because we're on this amazing exponential curve of knowledge acquisition that is so enriching and so enlivening. I'm a little worried that we don't have the incoming STEM workforce talent that this situation would merit, given its promise, given the excitement that all of us who are in this feel about, gosh, wouldn't you want to do this versus almost anything else you'd want to do your life. But that doesn't necessarily get trickled down right now to the younger generation. We are not in a place, I think, where we have a really encouraging pipeline of new talent coming into this space, even though the scientific promise is enormous. But I think the discoveries that are waiting to be made that are going to have profound implications for understanding human health are going to happen. We are going to figure out how to deal with Alzheimer's disease, as hard as that has been and as frustrating as that has been. And it's not right around the corner, but we are going to figure it out. We're going to go to that next step where stage 4 cancer is actually something like, okay, we know what to do for that. We'll get to diabetes, Esther. We'll figure out that, in fact, the combination of genetic susceptibilities and environmental exposures will lead us to give a very precise, personalized recommendation to people about how not to get the disease as opposed to trying to manage it when it's already far advanced. All of those rare diseases that I talked about that we might be able to have access to with new tools like gene therapy and gene editing, those are going to start to happen. And that, I think, means that we ought to be able to look at our future and say, anybody ought to have access to good preventive medicine that is going to be successful in keeping them healthy and have not just a good lifespan, but a good health span. And if you do actually fall through that and come up with an illness, that something's waiting for you that is going to be affordable. The All of Us program is one way that I hope we're going to learn more about how to do this. By the way, if you haven't already joined All of Us, tonight is your night. All of Us is this cohort of 500,000 people on the way to 1 million who agree to be part of this really national adventure to find out how genes and environment and health behaviors and everything else about us plays out in terms of whether you stay healthy or whether you develop an illness. If you're part of this, join allofus.org. That's all you need to know. You basically get your genome completely sequenced for free, and they give you all the results back so you'll know what was there. You will share information about your health behaviors. You will share your access to your electronic health records, appropriately anonymized so that nobody knows it's you. And you will have this incredible band of researchers trying to figure out what we can learn from that in a fashion that's never really been tried before at this scale. So that we're going to learn a lot from that will, I think, empower this precision approach to prevention and treatment. But what I'm most worried about is how this actually does play out in our healthcare system, which is broken and which is incredibly wasteful because of the way that we do things, which is oftentimes driven more by litigation than about concerns about the patient. And where, unless you happen to be somebody who's in a circumstance with the good third-party insurance, you may have a hard time being able to take advantage of all these advances that are happening. And that is a shame on our nation. And yet, I don't see a lot of promising steps forward right now about getting beyond where we are. We made some progress, but let's be clear. We have racial inequities that are shot through our social system, and that they are playing out in healthcare in ways that we should all be ashamed of.
Yet another reason why your confirmation was unanimous in the U.S. Senate. Esther, and then we'll get to your
briefly,
questions.
I mean, it goes to exactly what Corey was saying. It's not up to the individual. There's systemic racism. There's systemic marketing of probably the
You need an advocate. You need an advocate in healthcare.
Right. The best thing that happened this week was California passing a law that you could no longer sell menthol cigarettes. But there's still a huge amount of advertising of unhealthy food, especially to Black children. There's, neighborhoods that education, poor food. That's what creates poor health, much more than a lack of medical attention. The medical attention comes later. But maternal mortality among Black women is scary. And it's a combination of what they come into the hospital with, which is much unhealthier conditions, and often hospital systems that don't respect all their patients equally.
And perhaps going back to the issue of profits. Questions? Who has questions? Where's the microphone? Don't be shy. Oh, yes.
Roving
We answered
microphone was offered.
This gentleman in the front.
Vint surf.
I know. I'm waiting for the microphone. Thank you, Vind.
Thank you very much. I never pass up an open mic. This was a
We
fascinating,
know. No.
fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for how well you organized it. I have two words that occur to me. One is accountability, and the other one is agency in the context of the situation we find ourselves in the online world. And so I'd like you to think for a moment and opine on how we can increase accountability for bad behaviors in the online world, bearing in mind this is an international problem The network is global in scope. The packets don't notice when they've passed across an international boundary. So if we're going to achieve accountability, we're going to need cooperation and collaboration on a international basis. Agency has to do with how people, organizations, and countries have the ability to defend themselves. How can they adopt practices and governance that will achieve increased safety and security? So those are the two words I'd like you to address.
What is your recommendation?
Yeah, can I ask Vint a question? Because
Yeah.
I've heard this recommended and it has a certain appeal. What if we actually asked anybody who's using social media and the internet to make a pledge that I will not put something on social media unless I am convinced that it's true. I will not distribute somebody else's claims unless I verified that I think it's true. And I will not write out language to somebody that I wouldn't do if they knew it was me writing it. That anonymization is not a reason to be uncivil.
So in fact, anonymization is not our friend here. If you're going to achieve accountability, you have to find out who people are who are behaving badly. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to identify yourself, whenever you use these systems. But it's kind of like license plates, they're gobbledygook, but some people are allowed to translate the gobbledygook into who owns the car that the license is on. And that is penetrating the veil of pseudonymity. And I think in this online environment, we would need to have the ability to identify parties. So if they took the pledge, whoever they are, and they violate it, we have to have the ability to discover who they are in order to hold them accountable. And so this business of anonymity can't be absolute.
A lot to unpack. Esther and then Corey, quick comment. Esther.
It's really hard to do that on an individual basis, but I think one interesting thing to think about is how the insurance industry reduced fire. Instead of spreading the risk, they reduced the risk by taking on the liability. And so, I'd love to see an insurance industry that would agree to insure, say, Facebook against various charges, but then hold Facebook accountable. If Facebook did it, their premiums will go down. To the extent that they saw Facebook not doing the job properly, the premiums would go up. And so you create a third party that's more agile than a government, but that basically imposes that accountability financially and is a little more flexible, but also willing to make judgments in a way that a government can't.
And aren't we seeing this unfold with Twitter right now?
Yes. Again, Twitter is
Your head wants to explode.
Well, Twitter has so many different problems, including governance, a nutcase person who's being enabled by all the people around him. It's interesting to see how well run SpaceX is by Gwynne Shotwell, who actually runs the place, versus what's happening at Tesla and now especially Twitter. And the culture that enables that sort of bro, cool dude thing is hugely part of the problem.
I still don't understand the sync, but that's a whole nother story.
So I have to disagree about anonymity. We wouldn't have Me Too without anonymity. We wouldn't have the Pentagon Papers without anonymity. Those are accountability movements. Those are movements that have actually really, really been about accountability in very important and meaningful ways. If you work for Twitter and you criticize Elon Musk, he will fire your ass. And so the only way to criticize Elon Musk, for example, to say, well, with the trust and safety team gone, we see this political disinformation spreading. If you want to keep your job and if you're on a work visa and you don't want to get deported, or say you've got a chronically ill child and you don't want to lose your health care, is anonymously. And so anonymity is key to accountability in a society of power differentials.
Thank you.
But does it justify incivility?
Well, I just don't know that you prevent. So
You can't.
I have had named individuals who I knew who they were be unbelievably uncivil to me. The argument that if only you make people tell you who they are, they will be civil to you, has been disproved by Donald Trump on a weekly basis for the last 5 years.
That's an outlier.
By your
I'm
former
sorry, that's not
colleague
the point.
spreading lies.
Yeah, that too.
So, Corey, that's not the point. The point here is absolute anonymity is not your friend here.
Well,
So even
it's
if you
complicated.
protect anonymity for purposes of whistleblowing and other kinds of things and for criticizing, in the event that the anonymous party is actually causing serious harm, we have to be able to identify them,
But
to
who-
hold them accountable.
But
Who decides that?
Yeah, so so as someone who has been threatened by the billionaire who owns the NSO Group, a billionaire who built a private terminal at LAX and set up a thing to make rich people feel great about how bad poor people had it, a billionaire who owns a fake greenwashing credit card company, a billionaire who owns a fashion brand, I can tell you that access to civil justice and the ability to compel the production of sources is not evenly distributed. It is heavily concentrated in the hands of people that we want to have be anonymous. So the Pentagon Papers, who would we have given the power to unmask the source behind the Pentagon Papers that we could have trusted that with?
You are, I realize I'm messing up your
No,
your
it's
plan
fine.
here, but this is a classic example. What I think you and I think I agree with you, but the place where we're having a disagreement is that you seem to be saying that absolute anonymity has to be maintained. And I'm struggling with that because I don't know how to hold people accountable for bad behavior.
Sure.
I'm
I
not
just don't know-
disagreeing with the Pentagon paper
Right.
revelation. I'm disagreeing with parties who can cause serious harm because they are
Sure.
anonymous.
But I don't think that this is distinct from the argument that strong working cryptography puts people to risk in as much as people can do bad things with working cryptography. I don't know how to make a system of an anonymity that only fails when good guys want to pierce it. I don't know what the civil justice system is that pierces the anonymity that is only available to President Good Guy and not President Crazy Guy.
Well, you've already accepted a certain amount of piercing of the veil because that's how your license plate works on your car. So we have introduced certain amounts of accountability by piercing at least one of the veils.
Yeah, but we
as
don't
an
make
example.
pedestrians wear license plates.
I beg your pardon?
We don't make pedestrians wear
I mean,
license plates.
license plates
The
are,
li-
we used
the
to
you
have
can
license-
easily cheat.
The
with a
license plate is
plate.
about identifying a licensed driver, not a licensed person.
No, it's actually about who owns the car. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do with who was
Right,
driving
a
it.
licensed vehicle, but not a licensed person.
And it's pretty easy
So
to
you don't need
fake
to
an
be a license
identity.
to be a person.
Well, if you were worried that it was going to be cold tonight, we will take care of that problem by igniting the fire right here. Thank you for letting me.
Thank you. We have a
intervene.
question over here. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, good evening. My question's prompted by Dr. Collins' candor at the mic when discussing experts giving knowledge but maybe coming across as elitists, and that there's a breakdown in that communication between experts. From when I was young, an expert could sit there and fill you up with knowledge, and you said, this is great. An expert's telling me this. He has a PhD in 30, 40 years. But it sounds like that one of the huge stumbling blocks in society right now is the acceptance of experts again, due to this idea that they're talking down or being elite. I'm curious what the panel thinks about trying to turn around this trend, since it's put us in this vicious situation. Thank you.
Boy,
Yeah.
how much time do we have?
Yeah, it's a very serious situation. And again, it also reflects, I think, a distrust not just of the people, but also the institutions that those people represent, whether it's government or whether it's a university, or sort of seen as, up there in the clouds somewhere, or certainly if it's somebody who works in industry, who are automatically assumed, therefore, to really be just interested in making money, and they don't care necessarily whether what they're saying is true or not. And there's a lot of reasons that those things are really dangerous to our future, but there they are. I think this is a general reflection of the kind of breakdown in the way in which our society has had over many decades or centuries a sense that expertise matters. And how do we deal with that? I think because it is so shot through with political and other tribal voices, I don't think there's much of a solution other than figuring out ways that the source of information can come from a broader network and not from a short list of individuals who are already seen as somehow compromised because they represent those elitist institutions. And I'm talking about myself here as well as others. I think we did see some mistakes made. Let me be clear, because it sounds like I'm saying, oh, well, all of us who are communicating science did a great job. We did okay, but you know what? I think we, in many instances, failed to really use the occasion to explain the process of science, which is when you make a public health recommendation about a pandemic, you're kind of looking at the information you have in front of you and doing the best you can, but it's pretty likely that it's not altogether right and that it may have to be changed again in a few more weeks or a month. We didn't do a very good job of explaining that. There was sort of this roundup towards certainty, which you felt sort of compelled to do to try to reassure people, yes, we know what to do, when oftentimes we didn't quite know what to do. And so now you don't wear a mask, and now you wear a mask, and people pretty soon begin to say, these people don't know what they're talking about. They're just jerking us around. We lost, I think, along the way, a lot of the opportunity to be seen as credible voices. That was a lesson that I think has to be remembered the next time, that when you're talking about a rapidly moving scientific situation, you're going to be really transparent to say, we're doing the best we can with what we've got, but it might be wrong, so stay tuned. We didn't do that very well. But again, coming back to what I said earlier, I think the idea of some kind of a network, a science communication core, or whatever you want to call it, may be our best antidote to the general dismissal right now of scientific expertise, by basically spreading it around and putting it in your community and not in somebody, in Washington, D.C., which if you're somewhere in Nebraska, doesn't sound like somebody you would necessarily resonate with.
Another question. Yes, please go ahead. Thank you.
Hi, thanks very much. So as someone who read a lot of Clarke and was very inspired as a younger person, and spends a lot of time thinking about and working on STEM education, and picking up on something that Dr. Collins, you said earlier, given the younger folks in the audience tonight, is there something that one or more of you could say, in terms of inspiration about the future, about what you see coming, about the role that they can play? Because, to me, that's ultimately why we're here.
Yeah.
And before we get an answer, if we have one of the students who can ask one of the final questions, that would be terrific. Who wants to take that on? Esther?
There's a student.
Yeah, go ahead.
First, hold us accountable. And then whatever you do, hand on something better to the people you create and to whom you will pass on the world.
So 40 years ago, Margaret Thatcher said there is no alternative. It was the most anti-science fictional, anti-imaginative thing you could say. It's basically a demand disguised as an observation. When you say there is no alternative, what you mean is stop trying to think of an alternative. And the job of science fiction writers is to imagine alternatives, not because they're predicting them, but because by showing that there is an alternative, you make it possible for people to strive for more. I have a colleague, James Boyle, who's brilliant. He's a copyright scholar. He's at Duke University, runs the Center for the Public Domain with Jennifer Jenkins. And he says, before we had the term ecology, people didn't know that they were on the same side. You cared about owls, I cared about ozone layer. How are we fighting the same fight? You're worried about charismatic nocturnal avians. I want to know about the gaseous composition of the upper atmosphere. That's not the same thing. The term ecology turns 1,000 issues into a movement. There are a lot of people out there who are worried about various forms of corruption, various forms of evidence-based policy falling by the wayside in favor of the parochial interests of powerful people. They're not wrong to worry about it. Some of them have misplaced that worry, but the worry itself is well-founded. When we understand that if you're angry because all the eyeglasses in the world are made by one company, Luxottica Essilor, which also owns all the retailers and also makes more than 50% of the lenses and also owns the largest insurer and has raised the prices of glasses by 1,000%. And I'm angry because there used to be 30 wrestling leagues and now there's one, and the rapey, Trumpy billionaire who owns it has made all of his employees into contractors, taken away their health care and sent them to beg on GoFundMe for pennies to die with dignity of their workplace-related injuries. And they're angry that there's only 3 shipping cartels left in the world and they keep building bigger ships. So when the regulators say, one of those is going to get stuck in the Suez Canal one day, they say, go to hell, what do you know about building bigger ships? That we're all fighting the same fight about corporate concentration and the ability to turn truth-seeking into an auction. Then we can make a difference. That is the future where we have a coalition that really makes things change, because something that cannot go on forever will eventually stop.
Before we get to your final question, my final question at the very end is, in your areas of expertise, just spend a half a minute, what excites you the most about the future? Think about that. You get the final question. Tell us about yourself.
Hello, sorry. My name is Siobhan Greenfield. I'm a student at Basis DC. I'm in 9th grade. Esther, my
You study math, science, engineering?
Ninth
basically
grade.
all of it.
Go ahead.
Closer, sorry. Esther, my question is directed at you. You brought up how basically short-term relief is going to, in a way, destroy us, and I kind of agree with that. And I think it's especially a problem we see in teens these days. I've seen it in my community, I've seen it in my school, I've seen it with my friends, that it's so easy these days to get addicted to these social medias, and I think it's really hurting a lot of teens these days. So my question is, how do you plan to fight that? Like, what's your approach?
I can't do it alone, but I'm actually working with an outfit called Sustainable Media that is focused on media and truth and anti-addiction and so forth and so on. They wanted to start a junior board, and I suggested that they bring in some junior people across the board rather than having the junior section, because your voices need to start being heard. To some extent, it's up to us to help, but it's up to you to organize and to reach out to your peers and help them understand what's going wrong. I mean, believe me, it ain't easy, but that's what it's going to take for. So I'm working on another little project, and the fundamental idea, when we talk about health, they did this really interesting study about bad food, and they talked to teenagers and said, you should eat right and so forth. And they talked to the boys, and they kind of changed the message to, the man is trying to manipulate you. They're trying to sell you this garbage and make money off you. We want to give you the ability to manipulate yourself. And I think that is the ultimate, most important message. Do not, understand yourself, understand what you want to do. Don't let society, advertisers, people who make money off you, try and control you to make more money off you. And I don't want to make kids cynical. I want them to become empowered and have a sense of agency, that they can do the right thing even more than the people trying to manipulate them can do the bad things.
Thank you for the question, and I know the challenges are great,
good luck with
especially
it.
for
Can we ask one
your
more?
generation. Yes, absolutely. Another question? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Dr. Collins, when did you start working for the president?
When did I? Well, I worked for 3 presidents. I worked for Barack Obama starting in 2009, way back then, as the NIH director. And then to my surprise, I was asked to stay on. And I worked for President Trump for 4 years, also as the NIH director. And then Joe Biden asked me to stay again. So I worked for another year and then stepped down as the NIH director. But then I got asked to come back to be an acting science advisor and now a special projects advisor. So yes, I've gotten to know a lot of presidents. And let me just say, they're all different.
So when you become president, you can hire him. So I just want to give you each a half a minute and end on the ideas of imagination and curiosity. Very briefly, what excites you the most about the future? Esther, Corey, and then Dr. Collins, the final word, very briefly.
In the end, AI and data gives us the ability to predict both the future and the counterfactuals. And I think we can do a better job of showing the impact of making some of the changes we've talked about and describing a better future that will actually make people invest in those changes that they keep resisting.
So I'm a materialist. I like stuff. And I know that we've got a limited amount of stuff we can make because we've got a limited planet. And I like the idea that a lot of the stuff that we have now that sucks, like the drill that you got in your drawer to make 2 holes in your wall a year, and that's like the minimum viable drill that doesn't burst into flame when you use it, will be replaced by like a totally awesome drill that would make the best drill that the best worksite has blush with shame, and that drill would just circulate. That you would know where it was. It would be, there'd be like a stochastic quantity of drills in your neighborhood. You could always lay hands on it. You wouldn't have to dedicate a drawer to it. Multiply that by lawnmowers and a million other things that we only periodically use, where everything in your life is amazing. And you don't need a garage full of junk that you never use. And we cut the material bill of our human civilization by 90% by giving everyone more. I found that really exciting.
Top that.
Yeah, whoa, wait a minute. Well, I am an optimist, and despite the fact we've talked about a lot of things that are wrong, there's a lot of things that are right. And for me as a physician, a scientist, my thoughts go immediately to what are we going to do about sustaining human health in ways that we still have to figure out solutions to. And I think we are at this remarkable moment of scientific opportunity. I think we will succeed in recruiting some of the best and brightest of this current generation, and may they be very diverse in their background. That's something we got to work on a lot harder, because diversity includes all kinds of potential that doesn't happen without it. So we didn't talk about that much, but if we're talking about STEM workforce, we got to talk about diversity or we're not really serious about it. And we will bring that kind of expertise on board, combine it with the kind of scientific opportunity with everything from basic science to clinical applications, and we will see an opportunity for more and more people to live out across the world, not just in our rich country, lives that are not cut short by illness, chronic disease, or death, and giving us a planet that is really much more a planet of people who are flourishing.
What a remarkable conversation. Thank
was.
you, all of you, for your participation. Walda?
I am. Thank you. May I
really
ask,
looking forward to it.
may I ask our panelists to please stand up, and so we can give them a much-deserved tribute and applause for this.
Thank you. That was great.
Okay. And we're not done yet. If you all can, don't wait, because we're going to take a picture. We're not done yet. I hope you've all, so please sit down. I hope you all have been enjoying the evening as much as I have. I think we have been left with some things to think about and some things to work out. I won't attempt to summarize what we heard. We've all got our own special takeaways. I do hope that what this evening has done for all of us is remind us about the essentiality of imagination in all its forms: creativity, innovation, curiosity, vision, which we seem to be lacking in a lot of quarters, even dreaming when acknowledged and made actionable. There's plenty of work to do. Not all ideas, as we've heard, of course, are worthy of action. Some can be downright awful. But let's think about what progress we can make if we listen to fresh thoughts and be prepared to take them seriously. And consider how much we gain if we truly communicate with young people and seek progress together. I want to just end here with some thank yous. Thank you, first of all, to our wonderful sponsors, who you see up there. They have made this evening and a lot of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation program possible. We thank you very, very much. And thank you to all of you who have given us your donations, your money, your time, and your attention. We really, really appreciate it. I also want to thank those who have worked hard to make this possible. Our wonderful executive director, this is the first time he's done this, Paul Julin. He, I think, has done a marvelous job, so thank you to Paul. And thank you to all of the volunteers that we have had here, who you've seen all around this place, and their names are in the bulletins. And a special thanks, of course, to Chef Daniel and to our colleagues at the French Embassy, who for a second year have made this just a marvelous and remarkable experience. I want to thank also Holly Russell, who is our photographer and also has helped us send out the wonderful teasing notes about the event over the last several months, and for Carol Nakamura, who is our webmaster and has done that. And I'm sure I am, oh, and of course, the board of the Arthur C. Clarke Foundation, who work hard all the time to make the mission of this foundation possible. And with that, I want to point out to all of you that thank you for not checking your emails, but now if you have bid, it's time to check your email. Because if you won, you will have an email and or a text saying it's time to go collect your reward and pay for it. And that will happen where you check out and get your coat. Now, it's not time to leave yet, though, because there is dessert and coffee outside, or tea or water, and more time to interact. And in a few minutes, our awardees will be, and our introducers will be joining us, and they're just going to stay behind briefly for one group photo. So go, have fun, enjoy yourself. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you for being here.